March 8, 1943. The brass bell above the door of Murphy's barbershop jingled softly as the morning sun filtered through the large front window onto Main Street in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Frank Murphy, aged 44, was sharpening his straight razor on a leather strop, the rhythmic sound filling the small shop like a metronome. The familiar smell of bay rum and talcum powder hung in the air, mixing with the scent of fresh coffee from the diner next door. Frank had been cutting hair in Millbrook for 22 years, ever since he returned from the Great War with steady hands and a need for quiet work. His barbershop was more than just a place for haircuts, it was the unofficial town hall, where men gathered to discuss everything from crop prices to the war overseas. The red, white, and blue Barber pole outside spun lazily in the March breeze, a beacon for anyone needing a trim, a shave, or just a place to sit and talk. But lately, Frank had been noticing things. Small things. Patterns that didn't quite fit. Men he'd never seen before requesting specific appointment times. Conversations that stopped when certain customers entered. Questions about other customers' schedules that seemed too detailed for casual curiosity. And yesterday, he'd overheard two customers speaking what sounded like coded language while discussing farm equipment prices. Frank had learned in France that small details often revealed big secrets. His years as a medic with the American Expeditionary Forces had taught him to notice when things didn't belong, when patterns suggested something beyond coincidence. And everything about his barbershop lately was setting off those old wartime instincts. He didn't know it yet, but his observations were about to transform a simple small-town barbershop into one of the most effective intelligence coordination centers of World War II. All it would take was a clever scheduling system, a keen understanding of human nature, and Frank's willingness to turn every haircut appointment into an opportunity for counterintelligence. The war had come to Millbrook, Pennsylvania. And Frank Murphy was about to prove that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with appointment books and a barber's chair that could serve as a command center for American intelligence operations. The barbershop as community center. By March 1943, Frank Murphy's barbershop had become the nerve center of Millbrook's wartime community. Every morning, local farmers, factory workers, railroad employees, and the occasional traveling salesman would gather in the shop's 4 chairs to discuss the war, share news from overseas, and coordinate the various civilian efforts supporting American troops. The shop's location on Main Street made it a natural gathering place, but Frank's personality made it indispensable. He was a skilled listener who remembered details, a careful observer who noticed changes in people's behavior, and a trusted confidant who could be counted on to keep sensitive information private. Men told Frank things they wouldn't share with their own families, and Frank had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of who was doing what, when, and why throughout the region. This knowledge had always been valuable for the social fabric of the community, but as the war intensified, Frank began to realize that it might be valuable for national security as well. Millbrook sat along important transportation routes connecting industrial centers with agricultural regions. The town was home to a small but critical aircraft parts factory, a railroad switching yard that handled military supplies, and several farms that produced food for the war effort. Anyone gathering intelligence about American logistics, production, or transportation would find Millbrook an ideal location for observation and reporting. And anyone operating covertly in the area would eventually need to blend into the local community, which meant they would eventually need a haircut. Frank's position as the town's only barber gave him unique access to everyone who lived in or passed through Millbrook. More importantly, his role as a trusted community figure meant that people naturally shared information with him that they might keep private from others. But Frank was beginning to suspect that not everyone who sat in his barber chair was who they claimed to be. And some of the information being shared in his shop was finding its way to people who shouldn't have access to it. The patterns Frank had been noticing weren't random. They suggested a systematic intelligence gathering operation that was using his barbershop as an observation post and information collection center. The question was what to do about it. Frank's military experience had taught him that the best way to counter enemy intelligence operations was not to shut them down, but to turn them against themselves. If enemy agents were using his barbershop to gather information, Frank would use their presence to gather information about them. He was about to transform his appointment book into a weapon of counterintelligence. Who was Frank Murphy? Francis Patrick Murphy had never planned to spend his life cutting hair. Born in 1899 in Millbrook, he had grown up on his family's small farm dreaming of adventure beyond the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, 18-year-old Frank enlisted immediately, eager to serve his country and see the world. Frank was assigned to the Medical Corps and spent 2 years in France as a battlefield medic with the 28th Infantry Division. The work was dangerous and heartbreaking. Frank learned to treat wounds under fire, to make life-and-death decisions in seconds, and to notice details that could mean the difference between saving a soldier and losing him. But Frank's real education came from his interactions with intelligence officers who occasionally worked with medical units to gather information about enemy activities. Frank learned to recognize when soldiers' stories didn't match their wounds, when casualties' patterns suggested specific types of enemy operations, and when small details revealed larger truths about what was happening on the battlefield. Most importantly, Frank learned that intelligence work was often about listening carefully to what people said, remembering details that seemed unimportant, and recognizing patterns that others missed. These skills served him well as a medic, but they would serve him even better as a barber. Frank returned to Millbrook in 1919 with a Purple Heart, a slight tremor in his left hand from a shell explosion near Below Wood, and no clear idea of what to do with his life. The farm held no appeal after what he'd seen in France, but he needed work that would accommodate his injury and allow him to be useful to his community. The town's elderly barber, Otto Schmidt, was looking for someone to take over his business. Otto had taught Frank the trade over the course of 6 months, emphasizing not just the technical skills of cutting hair and shaving faces, but the social skills of listening, remembering, and keeping confidences. By 1921, Frank had purchased the shop and established himself as Millbrook's barber, confidant, and unofficial keeper of community secrets. His military experience had given him a natural authority that men respected, and his genuine interest in people's lives made him someone they trusted. For more than 20 years, Frank had used these skills to serve his community in peacetime. But as World War II intensified and strange activities began appearing in Millbrook, Frank realized that his wartime skills might be needed again. The suspicious patterns. The first sign that something was wrong came in late February 1943, when a well-dressed stranger requested a haircut appointment for exactly 10:30 a.m. on a Thursday. The request itself wasn't unusual, but the man's insistence on that specific time was odd. Most customers were flexible about scheduling, especially for a simple haircut. The stranger, who introduced himself as Robert Johnson and claimed to be a traveling agricultural equipment salesman, asked detailed questions about other customers' schedules while Frank worked. Who came in regularly on Thursday mornings? What time did the railroad workers usually get their haircuts? When did farmers typically visit town? Frank answered casually, but he made mental notes of every question. In his experience, people who asked too many detailed questions about other people's activities usually had reasons beyond casual curiosity. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank noticed a pattern emerging. Several other strangers had requested appointments at specific times, always asking questions about other customers' schedules and activities. The questions seemed designed to build a detailed picture of when different types of people would be in town, what their routines were, and how they might be contacted or observed. More troubling was what Frank overheard during these appointments. Conversations that used agricultural terminology to discuss topics that had nothing to do with farming. References to harvest schedules that corresponded to train timetables. Discussions of seed shipments that matched the timing of military supply convoys passing through the area. Frank had heard enough coded communications during the war to recognize when ordinary words were being used to convey hidden meanings. And the meanings being conveyed in his barbershop had nothing to do with agriculture or business. The final confirmation of Frank's suspicions came when he noticed that information shared during these coded conversations was appearing in activities around town. Details about railroad schedules mentioned in his shop were followed by increased surveillance of the switching yard. Discussions of farm equipment deliveries preceded observations of the aircraft parts factory. Someone was using Frank's barbershop as a coordination center for intelligence gathering operations. The appointment system that Frank had developed to serve his customers efficiently was being exploited to schedule meetings between enemy agents and facilitate the exchange of sensitive information. Frank faced a critical decision. He could report his suspicions to authorities and potentially disrupt the operation, but that would also destroy his access to intelligence about enemy activities. Or he could find a way to exploit his position to gather information about the enemy network while appearing to cooperate with their activities. Frank chose a third option. He would turn his appointment system into a counterintelligence weapon, using his scheduling practices to control and monitor enemy communications while gathering detailed intelligence about their operations. The appointment book strategy. Frank's counterintelligence plan was elegantly simple. If enemy agents wanted to use his appointment system to coordinate their activities, he would give them exactly what they wanted, but on his terms and under his observation. The key was Frank's appointment book, a simple ledger where he recorded customer names, appointment times, and brief notes about the services requested. To any casual observer, it looked like routine business record keeping. But Frank began using it as a sophisticated intelligence-gathering tool. First, Frank modified his scheduling practices to create what appeared to be natural opportunities for enemy agents to meet and exchange information. He began offering specific appointment times that would allow suspected agents to arrive early, stay late, or overlap with each other in ways that would facilitate covert communications. But Frank also ensured that these opportunities occurred under conditions that allowed him to observe and document everything that happened. He arranged the shop's furniture to create natural listening posts where he could work while overhearing conversations. He developed techniques for appearing busy with routine tasks while actually monitoring who said what to whom. Most importantly, Frank began using his appointment book to track patterns of behavior among suspected enemy agents. He noted who requested appointments at the same times, who asked questions about other customers, and who seemed most interested in information about specific types of activities. Within 2 weeks, Frank's modified appointment system had revealed a sophisticated intelligence network operating in and around Millbrook. At least 8 people appeared to be directly involved in gathering and reporting information about railroad schedules, factory production, and military supply movements. The network operated on a rotation schedule, with different agents gathering information at different times and passing it to coordinators who transmitted reports to handlers outside the area. The appointment system that Frank had inadvertently provided allowed them to coordinate their activities without arousing suspicion through obvious meetings or communications. But Frank's observations also revealed vulnerabilities in the enemy operation. The agents relied heavily on the information sharing that occurred naturally in his barbershop, but they had no way to verify whether that information was accurate. They assumed that casual conversations among local residents reflected actual schedules and activities, but Frank realized he could manipulate those conversations to provide false or misleading intelligence. Frank was about to weaponize small-town gossip in service of American counterintelligence. Disinformation and manipulation. Frank's first experiment in strategic disinformation began with a casual conversation about railroad schedules. During a haircut for Tom Williams, a local farmer whose son worked at the switching yard, Frank mentioned that he'd heard military supply trains would be running earlier than usual next week due to maintenance work on the main line. The information was completely false. Frank had invented it to test whether suspected enemy agents were listening to and acting on conversations in his shop. But he presented it naturally, as the kind of local gossip that men shared while getting their hair cut. Within 2 days, Frank noticed increased surveillance activity around the railroad yard during the times when the fictional early trains were supposed to arrive. Enemy agents had taken the bait and repositioned their observation efforts based on false information provided through Frank's barbershop. Encouraged by this success, Frank began systematically introducing false information into the conversations that occurred in his shop. He mentioned fictional changes to factory shift schedules, non-existent meetings at the aircraft parts plant, and imaginary modifications to military supply routes. Each piece of false information was designed to waste enemy resources, misdirect their surveillance efforts, and test the responsiveness of their intelligence-gathering network. Frank was conducting a sophisticated disinformation campaign using nothing more than casual conversation and his role as a trusted community figure. But Frank also began using his position to gather accurate intelligence about enemy activities. His appointment book allowed him to track when suspected agents requested meetings, and his observation of their behavior revealed details about their operational methods, communication techniques, and reporting schedules. Frank documented everything in a modified version of his appointment book, using a simple code that made his intelligence notes look like routine business records. Customer names became agent identifiers. Service descriptions encoded information about suspicious activities. Appointment times tracked the schedule of enemy operations. To anyone examining Frank's records, they would appear to be the ordinary documentation of a small-town barbershop. But to someone who understood Frank's coding system, they represented a detailed intelligence picture of enemy operations in central Pennsylvania. Frank was conducting a one-man counterintelligence operation, but he was beginning to realize that the intelligence he was gathering was too important to keep to himself. The enemy network he had discovered was larger and more sophisticated than anything local authorities could handle. Frank needed to find a way to share his information with people who could act on it effectively, without compromising his position or ending his access to enemy operations. Making contact. April 15, 1943. Frank was finishing a haircut for elderly Mr. Peterson when two men in business suits entered his shop. They looked like insurance salesmen or bank representatives, but something about their manner suggested they weren't there for haircuts. "Mr. Murphy?" the taller man asked. "We're from the Regional War Production Board. We'd like to discuss some security concerns in the area." Frank set down his scissors and studied the two men carefully. Their clothes were appropriate for traveling businessmen, but their shoes were military issue. Their manner was polite but alert in a way that suggested training rather than natural personality. "What kind of security concerns?" Frank asked. "The kind that might benefit from the observations of someone in your position," the second man replied. "Someone who sees a lot of people, hears a lot of conversations, and might notice when things don't quite fit the normal pattern." Over the next hour, Frank learned that the two men were actually intelligence officers with the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA. They had been investigating reports of enemy intelligence gathering activities in central Pennsylvania and had identified Frank's barbershop as a potential source of information about suspicious activities in Millbrook. Frank provided a detailed briefing about everything he had observed over the past 2 months. The suspicious customers, the coded conversations, the patterns of surveillance activity, and his own counterintelligence efforts using false information and strategic scheduling. The OSS officers listened with growing amazement as Frank outlined an intelligence picture that was far more detailed than anything their official investigations had produced. "Mr. Murphy," the first officer said, "you've been conducting one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations we've encountered. Your intelligence about enemy activities in this region is extraordinarily valuable, and your disinformation techniques are genuinely innovative. What you've proven," the second officer added, "is that people in positions like yours, with natural access to community information and the trust of local residents, can be among our most effective intelligence assets." The officers offered to formalize Frank's operations, providing official support and expanding his activities to coordinate with other intelligence-gathering efforts in the region. But they emphasized that Frank's current approach, operating undercover as an ordinary barber serving his community, was crucial to the success of any expanded operations. Frank agreed to continue his work under OSS coordination, but he insisted on maintaining his cover and his normal business operations. The most effective intelligence operations, he had learned, were the ones that looked like ordinary activities to anyone watching. The systematic operation. With OSS support, Frank's barbershop became the center of a sophisticated intelligence network covering 3 counties in central Pennsylvania. Frank's appointment system evolved into a complex scheduling operation that allowed American intelligence officers to coordinate activities, share information, and monitor enemy operations throughout the region. The system worked through Frank's natural role as a community figure who scheduled appointments and facilitated social interactions. OSS officers and trusted local residents could request specific appointment times that would allow them to meet, exchange information, and coordinate activities without arousing suspicion. Frank's shop became a natural cover for intelligence meetings. 2 men waiting for haircuts could discuss sensitive information while appearing to engage in ordinary small talk. Agents could pass documents by leaving them in magazines or coat pockets. Complex operations could be coordinated through conversations about sports scores or weather patterns. But Frank also expanded his disinformation campaigns, working with OSS officers to develop false information that would systematically misdirect enemy intelligence gathering operations. Factory production schedules, military supply routes, and transportation timetables were all manipulated to waste enemy resources and protect American operations. The false information was introduced into community conversations in ways that made it appear to be natural gossip and legitimate local knowledge. Enemy agents gathering intelligence through Frank's barbershop found themselves reporting detailed information that was completely inaccurate, leading their handlers to make operational decisions based on false assumptions about American activities. Frank also began training other business owners in the area to recognize suspicious behavior and use their customer interactions to gather intelligence. The local diner owner, the hardware store manager, and the post office clerk all became informal intelligence assets, using their natural community roles to monitor and report enemy activities. The cumulative effect was to create a counterintelligence network that covered most of central Pennsylvania, with Frank's barbershop serving as the coordination center. Enemy agents found themselves operating in an environment where their activities were constantly observed, their communications were monitored, and their intelligence-gathering efforts were systematically undermined by false information. By summer 1943, Frank's network had effectively neutralized enemy intelligence operations in the region while providing American authorities with detailed information about enemy methods, personnel, and objectives. The major breakthrough. June 22, 1943. The breakthrough that would mark the culmination of Frank's counterintelligence work came through his most sophisticated scheduling operation yet. OSS officers had identified a high-value enemy agent who was coordinating intelligence activities across multiple states, and they needed to gather information about his methods and contacts without alerting him to American counterintelligence activities. Frank's solution was to create what appeared to be a natural opportunity for the agent to gather intelligence in his barbershop, while actually providing controlled access to false information and allowing OSS officers to observe the agent's operational techniques. The operation required precise timing and careful coordination. Frank scheduled a series of appointments that would bring together local residents who could naturally discuss the types of information the enemy agent would want to hear. But the information they discussed was carefully crafted by OSS officers to serve American intelligence objectives. The conversations the agent overheard revealed false details about military supply schedules, fictional changes to factory production, and non-existent security measures at transportation facilities. But they were presented in such a natural, convincing manner that the agent had no reason to suspect he was receiving disinformation. More importantly, OSS officers were able to observe how the agent gathered information, how he communicated with other network members, and how he prepared intelligence reports for transmission to his handlers. The operation provided a detailed picture of enemy intelligence methods that proved invaluable for disrupting other operations across the country. The false information provided to the agent was designed to trigger specific enemy responses that would reveal the location and activities of other network members. When the enemy acted on the false intelligence, American counterintelligence officers were able to identify and monitor previously unknown agents and operations. The success of Frank's operation led to the identification and neutralization of enemy intelligence networks in 6 states. More than 40 enemy agents were identified, and their intelligence-gathering capabilities were systematically degraded through disinformation campaigns coordinated through Frank's barbershop and similar operations in other communities. Frank's appointment book had become the central coordination tool for one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of World War II. The Hidden Victory. Frank Murphy continued operating his barbershop throughout the war, but his role gradually evolved from active counterintelligence work to training and coordination support. His techniques for using ordinary business operations as cover for intelligence activities were taught to civilians across the country, and his methods for community-based information gathering became standard practice for American intelligence agencies. The success of Frank's network demonstrated that civilian business owners, because of their natural access to community information and their ability to operate without arousing suspicion, could be among the most effective intelligence assets in modern warfare. Their knowledge of local patterns, their relationships with community members, and their ability to manipulate information flow made them invaluable for operations that would be impossible for traditional intelligence operatives. Frank never received public recognition for his contributions to American intelligence during World War II. The classified nature of his work meant that his role remained secret for decades after the war ended. Officially, he was simply a small-town barber who had served his community with skill and dedication throughout the difficult war years. But within intelligence communities, Frank's story became a model for civilian participation in national security operations. His techniques were studied and adapted for use in subsequent conflicts, and his approach to community-based intelligence gathering influenced Cold War operations and modern counterintelligence practices. More importantly, Frank's story demonstrated that heroism often takes quiet, unrecognized forms. While attention focused on dramatic battles and famous generals, Frank and hundreds of other civilian business owners were fighting their own battles against enemy operations on the home front. Their weapons were appointment books, customer relationships, and an intimate knowledge of how information flowed through their communities. Their battlefield was the ordinary interactions of daily life, and their victory was measured not in territory captured, but in enemy operations disrupted and American secrets protected. Frank passed away in 1961 at the age of 62, still operating his barbershop and still maintaining the habits of careful observation and discreet record-keeping that had served him so well during the war. His obituary described him as a respected businessman and community leader who had served Millbrook faithfully for 40 years. There was no mention of enemy agents, intelligence operations, or the network of civilian assets who had helped win a quiet victory on the American home front. But those who knew the full story understood that Frank Murphy had proven something important about the capacity of ordinary Americans to defend their country when called upon to serve. The lasting legacy. Decades later, intelligence historians studying World War II operations would identify Frank's barbershop network as one of the most innovative and effective counterintelligence operations of the war. The network's success in neutralizing enemy intelligence gathering while protecting American operations had prevented numerous security breaches and protected critical information about military logistics and production. But Frank's story represents something larger than military history. It exemplifies the principle that ordinary citizens, working within their natural community roles, can make extraordinary contributions to national defense when they understand what to look for and have the courage to act. The model established by Frank's network influenced post-war approaches to civilian participation in intelligence operations. Government agencies recognized that business owners, community leaders, and other civilians with natural access to information could be valuable assets for security purposes, provided they received appropriate training and support. Frank's legacy also demonstrates the importance of understanding that intelligence work is fundamentally about people and relationships. Technical capabilities and sophisticated equipment are important, but the most effective intelligence operations often depend on human skills like listening, observing, remembering, and building trust. Perhaps most importantly, Frank's story illustrates that heroism comes in many forms, and that some of the most important contributions to national security are made by people who never receive recognition for their service. Frank fought his war not with weapons, but with appointment books, false information, and the ordinary interactions of a small-town barbershop. His victory was measured not in enemies defeated, but in intelligence networks disrupted, American secrets protected, and enemy operations turned against themselves. He proved that sometimes the most effective form of resistance comes from people who understand their communities better than anyone else, and who are willing to use that knowledge to protect the things they value. Frank Murphy never considered himself a spy or an intelligence officer. He was a barber who noticed things that didn't belong and had the skills and courage to do something about them. But his story reminds us that in times of national crisis, ordinary people in ordinary jobs can become extraordinary defenders of freedom, using nothing more than professional knowledge, community relationships, and the willingness to serve their country in whatever way circumstances require. So here's my question for you: in your own work, in your own community relationships, what patterns might you be uniquely positioned to notice? What trust do people place in you that could be valuable for protecting important information? And if the moment came, would you have the observational skills and moral courage to turn your ordinary interactions into a tool for defending the things you care about? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this story if it changed how you think about the role of community figures in national defense. And remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not on famous battlefields, but in barbershops where skilled observers refuse to let enemy operations succeed in their communities. Disclaimer. This video is a fictional narrative inspired by the historical setting of WW2. Characters, events, and dialogues are created for storytelling purposes and do not depict real individuals or incidents. This content is intended for entertainment and creative education only.